Hello, everyone. Good morning. I hope you're all having a wonderful time and enjoyed your days in Córdoba, even though it's not very, very sunny, as we had expected it to. But I hope you had a very, very fruitful time in this conference. And thank you so much for joining the session on translating research assessment into practice. It is my huge honor to present this amazing panel with which we have here to discuss this subject with you all. And I'm going to start by introducing the panel which we have here, starting with Claire Morel, who is the head of unit in charge for the Marie-Skłodowska-Curie actions for the mobility and training of researchers and the development of excellent doctoral programs at the European Commission. But before that, she was the head of unit for international cooperation at DG Education, Culture, Youth and Sport at the European Commission, with particular focus on the international dimension of the Erasmus Plus programs and international policy dialogues in the higher education and youth issues with various partners of the EU in the world. She has worked several years with the countries neighboring the EU, but before that, she worked for the Tempus program for higher education modernization, cooperating with Central Asian countries, and for the European Training Foundation, an agency of the EU based in Turin, on the reform of vocational education and training systems in the eastern neighboring countries and Central Asia. Thank you so much, Claire, for joining us today. We also have Karen Stroobants, who is a policy advisor on the research landscape and economy for the Royal Society of Chemistry UK, and is the director of the research culture consultancy, Culture-Based Counseling. Recently, she was elected as the vice chair for the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, and she is a governing board member for Euroscience. Karen has contributed to drafting of the European Agreement on Reforming Research Assessment together with DG RTD, Science Europe and EUA, and led the development of the Royal Society's resume for researchers. She is also a chemist by training and holds a PhD in inorganic chemistry from KU Leuven, Belgium, and has served on the board of MCAA between 2020 and 2022, prior to which she was also the vice chair of the policy working group. Thank you, Karen, for being here. We also have a speaker joining us online, Rita Morais from the European University Association. Rita is an advisor for research and innovation at the European University Association. Rita has been mainly involved in the areas of open science and research assessment. And prior to joining EUA in 2013, Rita worked for different Brussels-based organizations in the field of education. She also holds a PhD in social psychology from ISCTE University Institute of Lisbon, Portugal. Thank you so much, Rita, for being here.
Thank you.
And last but not the least, we have Giulia Malaguarnera. I get it right, okay. Who is a researcher with experience in academia, industry, and policy. She is a PhD in pharmacology, neuropharmacology, and worked at the University of Catania, University College London, and in France, and has a Marie Curie individual fellowship in a startup company. She's currently the secretary of MCAA, a former president of Eurodoc, and the member of Policy Working Group, with a strong focus on open science, research assessment, and communication. Giulia also works at Open Air as an outreach and engagement officer, loading with all the actors in the open science ecosystem to enable them to practice open science. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here. And as you all know, this panel discussion was supposed to be on how do we even translate research assessment into practice, because we've all heard a lot of conversation about research assessment, the need for having research assessment, but my question for this panel would be, how do we even begin to implement all of those recommendations into practice that would actually really help researchers that we all feel is the need of the hour. So for starting this session, I want to ask the panel members here if you can just briefly explain the research assessment. Maybe Karen, you can begin.
Thank you. So this was quite an open question. So there's three things I will mention. I've just chosen things that I'm interested in around research assessment because there's lots to say. The first point I think that is important to understand is why we're actually talking about this subject. And I'm just bringing my personal perspective. So the way that I came to the subject of research assessment is partly through experience. So there's practices that I've seen in my own research career that I found quite disappointing in the way that the system defines success. So that's the very starting point. Really, already during my PhD, I was involved in initiatives to try and make changes to that in Flanders. I must admit those weren't very successful at the time. It was maybe too early. Maybe the community wasn't ready to progress in the way that we, I think, are progressing today. But also, my first job in policy was working on a project around research culture. So it was spanning a lot of different topics, including inclusion and diversity, mental health, researcher careers, integrity, open science. And the big conclusion of that program of work was that a lot of issues in each of these areas really link together around the assessment system and the way that we incentivize researchers. So where my focus is partly still on culture, and especially on how you shape culture, I've really narrowed down and focused on assessment, partly because I believe changes to assessment can be a really important lever to improve all those other areas as well. So that is partly the first point, why I've been getting involved in that. The second point, and that is maybe more an answer to your direct question, how can we start to implement these things? So, of course, I'm representing partly here the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment. And it's not an easy question to answer, which is why we set up a coalition to work together. I think yesterday in his speech, Peter Gluckman referred to big complex problems as wicked problems. And I do think this is one of those wicked problems where we're not looking for one solution. We're going to have to collaborate. We're going to probably end up with a range of solutions. They might be different for different organizations, for different institutions. But at the same time, we'll need to make sure that we don't put any barriers to mobility. So that is the balance we'll need to strike to ensure that there's autonomy for different organizations to find their new ways, but in a way that doesn't cause conflict or put up barriers to the mobility of researchers. And I don't think even we have the right solutions yet today. We have a direction. The agreement that we drafted last year sets a shared direction, but the work ahead of us is to really fill that in with more concrete solutions and to work together on those. And then the third point, the last point I'll make in this opening statement is one thing that is very close to me that I think we are not seeing yet at the moment in the discussions is how to go beyond outputs and activities. Because for me, one of the big problems at the moment is that we are very fixated on the very end point. A researcher does their job and they go through a very long process where they do a lot of different things, where they have rigor, where they show lots of different behaviors, where they maybe need to manage a team, where they have a need for lots of different competencies to deliver those projects in the best, most effective way. And the thing we look at is the very output at the end. We don't consider that whole process in the way that we evaluate them in many instances. And that is, for me, the vision for the future is that we really have much more attention for the process itself and much less for the output at the end, including also attention for competencies. And this is not rocket science. This is done probably in every other sector already. There are questions that you can ask about how you manage, where you force people to reflect on their behaviors, to reflect on their approaches and their strategies to deal with situations. It's something from my own experience that has been absolutely, completely missing from academia and that I had to learn to go in other sectors. So I also truly believe that if we can make that a part of the assessment, it will also enable mobility between sectors in a way that is, I don't think, possible today. So that's probably something for the next 50 years in terms of horizon of getting there, but that's really my big hope is that we can incorporate those kind of elements in the future. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was quite insightful, and I quite like the fact that you mentioned about how we should focus more on the process than the output for at least the time being. And at this point, I think I want to ask Rita this question, that I know that, you know, reforming this research assessment requires cultural and systemic changes. And I just want to ask you, like, what are the expectations from the European University Association for after signing this agreement? If you can just briefly explain that.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me well. Let me know if not. Yes? Okay, great. So Just to go a little bit back for a couple of minutes. So UA has been working on research assessment already for several years. We started from the perspective of open science and open access when UA published its roadmap on research assessment in the transition to open science already back in 2018. And we've also conducted a survey to our members, so to universities across Europe, on the role of open access in research assessment. Research assessment, and particularly academic assessment, which is a broader area encompassing other activities that researchers are typically involved in, so like teaching, innovation activities. These are strategic priorities for UA. And we see the reform of academic career assessment, including research assessment, as a critical enabler of success of universities. And we see then research assessment as a first step in this direction. And by signing then the agreement, to come back to your question, we want to, as an association, we want to raise awareness on the topic to our diverse membership, because we have over 800 members, which are in different countries, have different profiles. We want to foster discussions leading to joint action on reforming research assessment. And as Karen has alluded to in her intervention before, so current reward systems, they're heavily based on publication metrics. They introduce a range of distortions in assessment. They don't capture properly the range of activities that researchers are engaged in, much less the process, as also Karen mentioned, that is not considered. And the quality and impact of research activities and careers are then evaluated using proxy indicators rather than on the merits of research itself, to come back to research assessment. So EUA really supports the development and the implementation of more responsible, transparent, sustainable evaluation practices for research activities and careers. And we really aim to support the development of those assessment approaches that balance qualitative peer review with quantitative metrics, considering the context of the assessment, the purpose of the evaluation, and the different missions and profiles of institutions, of course, based on then broad definitions of quality and impact aligned with the institutional missions. So these are our, like, say, main expectations for the agreement and for joining the coalition.
Thank you for your answer, Rita. And I completely agree with you on the fact that the main crux of the whole research assessment is to go beyond these matrices that you mentioned about the H index, the I index, and all of these things. But I know that that has been a priority also for the Commission, and that is it's a conversation we have had for a long time about what is the metric on the basis of which you would grade, if I for the lack of a better term, researchers. So I have to ask you now, Claire, like, what are your expectations from MSCA?
Well, thank you very much, and I think both Karen and Rita explained, gave the, where this new approach comes from. I think this agreement sets a common direction for very much needed changes. And in a way, MSCA, I think, was a precursor when it comes to assessing researchers' achievements and researchers' careers. Because the evaluation criteria of the MSCA, I think for long, and maybe since the beginning, have integrated already many aspects of the commitments which are emphasized in this new reform of the assessment, of the research assessment. For example, compliance with ethics, integrity rules and practices, academic freedom, ensuring that gender equality, equal opportunities, including, of course, through the type of funding that the program provides. Also ensuring that there is a broad range of evaluation criteria. I think all of you have gone through these evaluation criteria. So we take into account not only purely, of course, the research activities, the diversity of the missions, including teaching, mentoring, supervising, innovation, communication, outreach, cooperation with the non-academic world, the role of mobility in international careers. So, I mean, all these evaluation criteria have, I think, almost forever been part of the DNA of the MSCA. So we are extremely interested in what's happening with the work of the coalition. We are following it very closely. And for example, under Horizon Europe, so the new framework program, we have adapted our evaluation criteria to be sure that we are fully compliant with these new. For example, we have taken into account the new practices of open science that contributes both to the quality and the impact of research. So we will continue to really to regularly update the evaluation criteria to be sure that we completely stick with these principles. And the objective of the MSCA is not only to have an impact on individual researchers, but to have an impact on institutions. Because the institutions, when they receive funding from MSCA, they must stick and they must adhere to the principles that are in their grant agreement and in the charter for researchers and the code of conduct for the recruitment of researchers, which sets the principles such as, you know, merit-based, transparent recruitment procedure, and which, of course, in the selection process take into account the full set of missions of the researcher. So I think by, you know, when a funding program like MSCA can have a tremendous impact not only on individuals but also on institutions. And so this is why we are looking really forward to work closely with you and to see how we can, little by little, let's say, take on board all the principles, and we can test them as well through MSCA.
Okay. Thanks, Jaishree. As was mentioned by Karen, the research assessment is a bigger framework. We started with open science as a main principles for which these changes has to come. But in the reality, there are a lot of things that we don't measure. In any case, the European Commission has involved the yearly career researchers since the start with now the skill set of researchers and that the new framework, because we started this conversation when we were changing the charter and code, and both the Marie Curie Alumni Association, Eurodoc were present to enforce the fact that the yearly career researchers want a change in the research culture, but they are encountering several difficulties due to the fact that we are in a process of devolution. Usually, mid and senior researchers are less affected because they are not precarious as us. And this is why we need to translate what are the principles, the vision, in something that is practical and is feasible for all the researchers to come. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point that you made, and that brings me to my question about the fact that we have had this conversation, like you were very rightly mentioning, that open science is not a new concept. We have been talking about this, and we've been trying to integrate this, and especially early career scientists. I mean, especially like I consider myself one of early career scientists as well, but I realize that even though people want to practice open science, but they don't have enough information about how do we even go about it. So I want to move to Karen to ask a question about, like, you are a researcher and now you are also a policy advisor, and you were actually the pen holder to drafting this agreement as well. So in your opinion, from a researcher's perspective, what all aspects did you account for while drafting this agreement to help really facilitate the implementation part of it?
Thanks, Jaishree. And I mean, a lot of things have been said already, but I think we are now coming to the implementation. And just maybe first to respond to Claire, I think it's really important that some of the front runners in this will be involved in the coalition, because we have a lot of members who are also keen to learn from those who are already a bit ahead with setting out procedures and criteria that are already according to the principles. And I think there's definitely good examples from the European Commission on that, but also some countries have been really working on this already for quite a few years. I'm thinking especially of the Netherlands, Finland and Norway. They have really really interesting, all quite a bit different, but really interesting examples of how to move forward. So that's maybe just a quick response, that I think it's important to have those on board, because I think the core of the coalition will really be to learn from each other and to share information. In terms of the agreement, the implementation, of course, will be the hard work. Drafting the agreement was not easy, I'm not going to say that, but this is where the hard work begins. But there are definitely a few places where I think it's been important for me and for some of the people in the core group as well. There was a core group advising on the agreement that were also coming more from an early career researcher perspective, that are now kind of reflected in the agreement. One of them is that the agreement includes commitments focused specifically on implementation, so around ensuring there's enough resource to actually do the work, raising awareness and training. So there's definitely commitments specifically around ensuring that we are actually able to put things in practice. And there was also an implementation group that supported the work before the launch of the coalition, but after the finalization of the agreement. So there's been quite a lot work going into drafting rules of procedure, drafting the starting points for actually really getting going with the work. In terms of the researcher perspective, I think the three main parts of the agreement where we've really implemented this is first, the commitments that are there on specifically reviewing and reforming assessment practices, criteria and tools. They specifically mention that this needs to involve researchers directly. The second is that there is a commitment on the evaluation of new practices to ensure that that's evidence-informed, but also that there is identification, first of all, of any unintended consequences, including on early career researchers, and hence they can be mitigated. So that's something that's specifically also integrated in one of the commitments. And finally, in those rules of procedure that I mentioned that were drafted more in with the implementation group, although only organizations can actually join the coalition, the rules of procedure for the working groups, which will really be the core working part of the coalition, they also stipulate that working groups where it's appropriate and where it's needed should invite experts. And this can include both experts in the sense of maybe specific groups of researchers who would be affected by any change that would be proposed, but it can be also research on researchers, so those who really actually study the research system.
Thank you so much for that answer, Karen. And I'm sorry I forgot to mention this in the beginning of this panel, but I've been told to inform you all that you can vote for the best poster session outside till 1 o'clock, and you've all received the email for it, and that's it. And that's all I want to say. But now I want to move to Claire, because like we've been talking about the open science implementation. So from the MSCA perspective, in the previously funded projects, like to what extent did you observe the actual implementation of open science practices in the projects that were finally reported back after the funding was over?
Well, we can see a clear difference between what happened under Horizon 2020 and now the new practices under Horizon Europe. Because under Horizon 2020, there were certain legal requirement to disseminate results, notably through open access or through scientific peer-reviewed publications. But these requirements have been much strengthened under Horizon Europe, and in particular to include new requirements linked to research data management and access. So under the new, let's say, version of MSc under Horizon Europe, now we put really a strong focus on the need to foster a culture of open science, innovation and entrepreneurship. And we are encouraging really our project to include a much wider range of practices beyond just outreach and beyond the legal requirements. So if we start with what happened under Horizon 2020, let's say the training provided to researchers was maybe was not an obligatory part of the project, which it has become. And now under Horizon Europe, we have introduced a new, under the excellence criteria, we have introduced the quality of open science practices. So now it's a full criteria under the excellence part of the evaluation. And this takes into account not only the mandatory open science practices, but also the recommended ones. I think this is quite a novelty of the program. What we are also, I mean, let's say that the ultimate objective of the MSCA is really it's to further advance knowledge and implementation of excellent science. And we are promoting as well participatory approaches, citizen science practices in different fields. And we are promoting these practices, for example, every week we are publishing information on the Fellows of the Week, and we're trying very regularly to promote these type of participatory approaches in excellent science. So I think these are a few, let's say, novelties which we hope will make a change under Horizon Europe.
Thank you for that answer, Claire. If I can move on to Rita to ask from the university perspective, what in your experience has been like the historical problems like at the institutional university levels in terms of implementation of open science practices, for example?
Yeah, or assessment practices also, or
exactly.
The reform. So we know that universities, they see reforming research assessment practices as a complex and a gradual process. So that's very important for them, not to change the system from one day to the other, because that's not possible in most cases. And we know from our surveys that the main barrier to changing the way assessment is conducted at universities is it's really the complexity of the process. So, and three things come into play here, mainly for universities. So one I alluded to already before is how to improve the balance between qualitative peer review and quantitative metrics. And here it's not just about finding, for example, new indicators or developing new and responsible practices, but this also includes more profound discussions on the goals and objectives of academia, on the values, and a bit on research culture, as Karen also mentioned in her introductory intervention. Then another very relevant point for universities is the heterogeneity of the situation in different countries and for different institutions. So on the one hand, there are varying and disparate levels of public funding across different countries, and also very different levels of autonomy, of institutional autonomy in conducting assessment, their own assessment exercises. And this creates a very heterogeneous context for different institutions where they have different starting points. So we've heard already that some countries are more advanced, others have a very centralized system where the room of maneuver for universities is much more limited. And this is also acts as a barrier. And also the differences across disciplines. So universities, they have many different disciplines working or research practices there. These all coexist in the same institution, and they need to be taken also into account in reform of research assessment. And just to come back to this point of the centralized systems, it's interesting perhaps to note that at least back in December, I don't know the recent numbers, the many institutions, so many universities that joined COARA, the Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, actually came from countries with a very centralized system. For example, Poland or Spain or even France. And so it's interesting to note this. And also interesting to note as a positive point that now in the framework of the ERA policies and ERA priorities, that member states are engaged in this area in reforming research assessment. So this is also a good moment to give more momentum to these initiatives that cannot just be focused on the institutional level, because we know that at least in some contexts, the regulatory frameworks restrict a little bit what institutions can do.
I completely agree with that point, Rita. I especially like the fact that you mentioned that even though there are policies and ways to implement open science at the Commission level, there are policies available, but there is a very heterogeneous system when you come to think about the institutions, the nations, and actually I can even go down to the group level, so where actually groups are performing research. So it is a very, very heterogeneous system, which is why this problem becomes really complex, because even though having a centralized system would be the way to actually implement it in a uniform manner, but that's not the case in point. That's not the reality of the situation. And I'm going to ask Giulia at this point, because Giulia, I know that you are a researcher and now you're also a policy advisor, and you really focus on open science, and you are working with Open Air, which is a very, very important infrastructure that's available for implementing open science. So I wanted to ask you, like, where's that question? I had written down this question, but yeah, my question is like, what are the instruments that are available at Open Air? Because that can be something that individuals can implement at their own level. So I just want to ask you that question.
Thank you. So Open Air stands for Open Access Infrastructures in Europe, and it's a part of the European Open Science Cloud. The idea is that at the European level there was the need to improve the digitalization and also the open science activities. So Open Air was a network that since the beginning with the European Commission was active in supporting open science activities in each country. So it's a network of people, but also infrastructures that are present in each country. What was the focus is still working and improving the scholarly communication. This is why the researchers are the key actors of the instruments that we are providing. In particular, when there was the shift between open access publication into open access data, Open Air was one of the first to create a backbone service that was collecting information and linking the information in order to contextualize the activities. So it's true that when we speak with the research assessment and we speak about open science, we have the tendency, as Karen has pointed out, that we are continuing in the direction of quantitative metrics in some way. But it's also, there is also the need to collect this kind of data. because in big numbers, the competence at higher level may be not so easy to track. When we are speaking about research assessment, we usually have the tendency to think about just the researchers' assessment, while in the framework, it's much bigger, because it's the institutional level from one side that have to recruit, but they have to be assessed to receive funding. And there is also the need from funders to monitor the activities and make policy decisions based on evidence-based data. So this is where open air and other infrastructures are speaking together to provide this kind of services. In practice, it's, for instance, when we are speaking about the research data management, it's something that is coming since the beginning. The beginning is the data management plan that all of us from the Marie Curie Alumni Association probably now knows, because it was, it has been the first requirement for all. And from the researcher's point of view, it always have been a pain, like why we should write this data management plan. And the reason is that we have to say how our research can be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. This is why you need experts to help you to produce this kind of data. This is why the institutions are coming to provide funding or to decide who should be recruited, if researchers or data stewards or research managers. So the fact is that what we are not considering when we are speaking about research is that we don't have to excel just on the scientific point of view, but we need to show this big impact. And fortunately, we have instruments that we can provide through training, policy alignment, and the services that are already present in the research ecosystem and that are funded by the European Commission. So it's not just a vision or an idea, but it's something that it's possible to do with the correct instruments and trainings.
Thank you for that answer, Giulia. And I like the fact that you said that there are instruments that are available to practice and the FAIR principles that you mentioned. It's really incredible that we have facilities available at the policy level, at the institutional level, and at the individual level. But then still there is somewhat like, we are making progress, I think, but we have to move in the forward direction even more. But at this point, I think I want to ask Claire again this question. I think you already answered it, that in the Horizon Europe, the evaluation, the excellence criteria is also based on the recommended practices. But besides that, do you have any more facilities available in under Horizon Europe for the implementation?
Yes, thank you. Maybe I would have liked to add a few things on the obstacles as well that our researchers are facing, because we do regular, we have regular surveys of our fellows, and we have done an ex-post evaluation of practices under Horizon 2020, and we see there is still a lack of knowledge amongst our researchers, amongst our fellows, and something that we need probably to step up and to increase, although it's now almost an obligation in all our projects, it's training on open access and open science. So anything that we can do together to increase this training and share this knowledge, in particular when it comes to intellectual property rights. I think this is an area where we've seen from the feedback from our researchers that there is really a need, I think, on our part to do more in terms of training. So when I mentioned a number of changes in legal requirements and the fact that a number of practices are now mandatory, that they were not in the past. For example, they include open access to publication, research data, as well to ensure responsible data management in line with the FAIR principle that Giulia has just mentioned. I mean, these have become mandatory. So I think in a way it's an obligation, of course, not only for the researchers, but for the institutions as well. The open access principles as well are rewarded during the evaluation. For example, I mentioned as well the involvement of different actors in the research process, preprints and other forms of early sharing of research results, participatory and open peer review practices. They are now awarded at evaluation stage. In addition to the training which we offer, but which also other parts of Horizon Europe offer to researchers, the Commission has put in place has launched a platform, Open Research Europe. In fact, all beneficiaries from Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe projects can publish on open access for free on this platform, and it's peer reviewed, and it relies, yes, on quite a robust system of open peer review process. The platform was launched in 2021, and I'm happy to say that MSCA researchers and fellows are big contributors to this platform. About 20% of all the publication on this free platform are from MSCA, so I think this is quite a concrete contribution of what the program can do to promote all these practices.
Thank you, Claire, for that answer. And yes, I completely agree that Open Research Europe was one of the it is one of the most important outputs that I personally can see for actually implementing open science, and it's free to publish there. And I can say that because I am one of the 20% who has published a paper there. So I want to move to Rita now. And if I know that we are a little short on time, and I want to have a little time for questions as well. But Rita, if you want to quickly explain if there are anything else that you want to talk about the infrastructural facilities at the university level for the implementation, if there's something.
Yeah, so it's more about framework conditions,
yes.
for open science too, but and for research assessment. So we think what's really important is that universities really engage in internal discussions on these topics, also with other relevant stakeholders, and really to progress on their own path of open science, but also of reforming research assessment. So I've mentioned before the different stages in which different universities and countries are in, and therefore also the need to involve different stakeholders, and especially in those most centralized countries, to also have the support of the national policy authorities. And we know that at least now for reforming research assessment, that is the case with the ERA policy process. And just about these reforms, so on the one hand, on open access, from our surveys, we know that this seems to be in a much more mature stage for universities, but that is definitely not the case for data, for fair data. So there's a lot to be done there. And also on the side of reforming research assessment, we know that this is something that it's going to take a long time. And we also know that some countries and some institutions, they are waiting to see what is going to happen before joining the movement or making further changes to their assessment systems. We know that some countries, they have like national policy reforms every few years. So it's important for them to understand what is coming next before they decide really to actively engage and embark on more transformations. So that's what I would add for the moment.
Thank you so much, Rita. I'm going to quickly ask Karen now. Like, I know that you talked about Quora, but I'm really interested in knowing what stage are we at right now?
Thanks, Jaishree. So the coalition For those who are not aware, so there was quite a long process where first the European Commission facilitated a consultation with stakeholders across the EU for, I think, a year to 18 months. And they started there, they already drafted a kind of document that set out principles for what we want from changes to research assessment. And it's then that a group came together, so including European University Association, Science Europe, who were already working for quite some time on the topic, and myself with the Commission on drafting the agreement. The agreement was finalized in July, and then there was this period where we worked with an implementation group to think about, okay, how do we now form a coalition so for people to really coalesce around this agreement and move it forward together. And end of last year in December, there was the Constitutive Assembly. So the coalition was created and a first steering board was elected. That steering board has taken some time now to find its feet, but there's also really already a lot of work going on behind the scenes. And we know that some organizations are impatient to start the work, but I think at the moment we have more than 420 members of the coalition. And the priorities, what we're focusing on at the moment is the first one is to set up the working group. So this will really be where the work happens. And we're hoping to launch a call for that in April. So we've really been working on how the process will work, how we will also ensure that these members can find each other if they want to work on the same topic, because they're not all connected at the moment. So those are the kind of problems we're working through at the moment. But I believe we're nearly there with a process that we can start to communicate and put into action. The second is, it's been really the ambition from the beginning that this initiative goes beyond Europe. So we are also creating a strategy for creating global awareness and really reaching members beyond Europe. Although I think we need to strike a balance there to ensure we also first have all the European countries on board. So that's another priority. And the last one is the agreement sets a time frame, and there's a first milestone in the agreement within 1 year of signing, where we ask not to have gone through a full cycle of review of assessment criteria, but to at least have put in place a plan for how to approach this in the following years. So we're also working on some kind of template or guidelines so that every organization who has signed has more view on the expectation or some kind of tool to help with working through setting out that plan. So those are the steps in motion at the moment. And for those who are in an organization, we've received many questions on when everyone's very enthusiastic to start. So we're really working very, very hard to get the working group set up as soon as possible.
Thank you for that answer, Karen. And from moving to the institutional level, I want to move to Giulia again. And Giulia, can you briefly explain what Grasporous is?
Okay, so the European Commission launched several calls to provide not only the vision with the Coara and other projects, but also instruments for tracking the research assessment. Grasporous is a new launched project that is led by the Athena Research Center and aims to provide a data space for tracking research assessment at different levels. So from one side we have a collaboration with Opus, in which the Marie Curie Alumni Association is working, and we presented yesterday. It's to profile and to have a profiling of researchers, to monitor, to have a research assessment on the level of the researchers. But we also are creating instruments for institutions and for having instruments at the country level. These kind of tools will serve the European Open Science Cloud, which together with ORE, that is focused on just the publication, peer review, and other system. By the way, all the Marie Curie Fellows can subscribe and try to be peer reviewers as well. So if you are struggling to receive peer reviewers at the very early stage of the research career, you can subscribe. This is something that as yearly career researchers, sorry if I change my hat, we pushed a lot, and we feel that we didn't communicate well. So we want to make sure that you know that if you are struggling with the peer review and you want to be assessed for the Marie Curie, you can actually subscribe through this instrument. But as I was saying, the research assessment is much bigger, and this is why we need tools that will be in the EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud. So this is the idea of Grasporous, but we are always welcome to the co-creation instruments. All the projects that are in the Waidera are open to constructive collaboration and criticism. So this is important for the Marie Curie alumni to monitor and to engage in discussion also at the policy level.
Thank you so much. I could continue to talk about this for all day long, but I do not want to take up the space. The whole point of this panel for me was, as an early career researcher, we wanted to bring together the funding agency, MSCA, the University, European University Association, so the institutions, the people who actually drafted the agreement, and people who have instruments. So I urge you all to, if you have any questions, to ask this wonderful panel. Please feel free to ask. I'm going to open the floor for asking questions. Yes, Gabor.
Thank you very much. I have one question. And there is one topic I haven't heard today, and that's assessment before the research work starts. So basically the recruitment and, how do we assess if someone fits for the job? Because my anecdotal experience about, all the recruitment services, what institutions, my institution as well, or PIs like myself, we carry out. Oftentimes, this is really suboptimal because we don't have time, we don't have effort, we don't know how to pre-screen applicants, how to make sure that we hire the right people to the right position. And this is something what I believe is an important prerequisite if we want to, set up a nicely working assessment system. But I never heard, and I have never heard about this topic being discussed in panels and discussions around research assessment.
Thank you. Yes. Thanks for that question, Gabor. I mean, it's a really important question, and it's one of the areas where we will be working with COARA. So we are really looking at assessment at all these different levels. There's been many things I'd wanted to respond to, but there's not so much time. But first of all, on the question of how do we improve that, I think first of all, there needs to be openness to learn from other sectors. The best examples I've seen of elements that are missing in academia, I've seen in other sectors. So I think one of the hopes I have is that with the coalition, some of the working groups will be willing to invite stakeholders from other sectors to help them think about the recruitment at that beginning. Because we're very good at the research, assessing the research. There's problems with that we can solve, but I think we're really having a lot of discussions around that, and I don't think that will be the issue. I think it's how do we assess some of the other skills and some of the other activities that we actually really need to have effective team management, to have effective skills in all the different areas that researchers are effectively involved in. And that is something where I think we can learn from other sectors. There needs to be a balance because the research environment is unique. I think there is also a lot of appreciation for some of those unique elements, and they are related to the way we assess. So we need to make sure we don't lose that uniqueness, but at the same time, there's a lot to learn, I think, from outside the academic sector that can help exactly with hiring the right person for the job, meaning all the elements of the job, not just the technical, but all the elements that come with managing a team, with international collaboration, which comes with quite huge challenges at times. So I think that's the first thing to say. And then just to briefly also respond, because I think this question also relates to the different levels of assessment, because now we are talking about individual. We are really exploring a lot of different methods, both on the quantitative and the qualitative side. And while I agree we will need different metrics to look at things like open science, I think there is a trap that we could fall in with starting to put metrics on everything, starting to measure how many open access publications has someone, how many open data sets. That would just generate a longer list of numbers that I think are just not very useful in assessing an individual. They have merits at the level of institutions, but I think there's really an inverse relationship between the size of what you're evaluating and the usefulness of a metric. So I think we really also need to, in the working groups in the COARA, think very carefully about which methods and which tools and which processes to use for which level of assessments. Because for me, the individual level should really sit with the qualitative methods, whereas at the aggregate level, you can start to see how metrics can become important to say something meaningful there. But yeah, we will need to really split that out. And I think at the level that you are aiming at, we will need to go for qualitative a lot more than we're doing at the moment.
Okay. I will answer with a question. So usually you are mid-career researchers, let's say. So you are already managing several people. But usually when you are recruiting people like PhD students or PhD candidates or students to create your project, you have in mind your goals. So things that we have to clarify is what are the goals that we need to focus. If the goals are from the founder's point of view to make an impact in policy evidence-based policy, or if we need to attract a new type of scientists to create a new knowledge, there are very different levels. Like having an impact in the scientific community and full stop, like a main priority. Or we need to tackle several other issues, like at the economical level, or if we have to do something related to the social challenges. So if we have clear in mind what is the scope that we want to tackle, we will be able to recruit people. This is why it's impossible to have a framework that works for everything, either disciplines or even stage in the career, because the goals are different. So if at the beginning we don't clarify what are the goals, for instance, for institutions, for instance, at the country level, or for making sure that we are giving equality to everyone, we can't neither try to create instruments. So I hope.
I have one mic. Do we have any other questions? Does Rita and Claire, do you guys have to? No? Oh, I have a question in the back. Jonas? Yes, I will come to you, Stephanie, after you.
Yeah, very nice discussion. Actually, I have a question related to the one from Gabor, also on assessment. So in my role as product manager, I'm also heavily involved in the preparation of proposals, and there's a lot of power in the templates of proposals because, of course, people would put what is requested in the proposals, and there's a lot of power what is written there, but also what is not written there. And at the end, there are evaluators who need to evaluate the proposals who are not briefed what actually is desired to get out of the proposals. And it's just a question, what is the strategy to make sure that the external evaluators actually understand everything what is discussed here, that is valued and also positively valued what is written in the proposals. Just to give an example, in the doctoral networks, if I'm not wrong, it's still a section describe the expertise of the supervisors, and I see a lot of people put their age factors impact factors and so on. So how can we make sure that it's really written in another way, or it's made sure that we evaluate the expertise of supervisors in the way we want, that it's described in the proposals, and how to make sure that the evaluators are aware of that?
Well, I think all the evaluators are briefed quite in detail on all aspects of the. No, they're not. Well, in that case, I mean, if you have a concrete suggestion on how the evaluators should be briefed, I mean, we are very happy to hear, I mean, your recommendation and your feedback, how this briefing can take place. If you're talking in particular on the issue of supervisors, we have issued guidelines recently on evaluators and on supervisors, on what their role should be, but also on the types of expertise and the types of training maybe that they should go through. And these guidelines on supervisors, they should in principle be presented to the evaluators as part of their briefing. I'm looking at my colleagues who is doing this type of, and I think it's the case, no? They receive at least whatever new guidelines, whether it relates to supervisors or new, let's say, policy dimension, and here talking about the new research assessment and etc. This is part of the let's say the feedback and the preparation and the training that the evaluators receive. I see that there are some reactions, maybe from researchers who have the impression that the researchers are not properly, maybe not on all aspects, or maybe that the training and that they receive is not, and the package and the information, etc., that they receive is maybe not updated enough, or they are not. In that case, I mean, please let us know. I mean, if there is no a way that we can improve that, we'll be completely happy to improve that. And if you have, I mean, if you have really, because I understand that you have very specific, there are specific aspects of this, of this information that you receive from us, which you think is not sufficiently developed or maybe not updated, please let us know. We'll be happy to look at it.
Yeah, I just wanted to react about this notion of the assessment when we recruit people. What I think could be interesting is to think about how we assess where people want to go in terms of their competencies. And I know that, Karen, you've been thinking about competencies and competency frameworks, but what I'm thinking is we have lots of people who arrive on ITNs, on postdoctoral fellowships, on whatever actually career stage in our labs. And what we think is indeed, you know, what is the goal? I agree. But then the goal should also be about a lot of transferable skills. It should also be a goal as to, you know, how you actually work with your team and how you develop specific forms of cultures. And you can't actually assess people on that if you don't know exactly where they're coming from. And where they're coming from, maybe that they come from a very different cultural background, where maybe they've seen other things in some labs, and you actually need to account for this to actually see the progress that they're making and to help them to develop in that. And I'm really wondering, you know, within the MSCA program, isn't there something that could be made, you know, like the data management plan, kind of compulsory, as having a talk and, you know, providing some form maybe of framework for this? Because I think it could truly help, especially for those who in the end will really try to go outside of academia, where they need to actually have developed those skills. So it's just a thought. Thank you.
I can first respond, but I'm sure maybe Claire wants to add as well. And I'm conscious, I think there's another session starting, so I'll be quick. I mean, I truly think that it would be valuable to add competency-based elements to the evaluation of researchers, partly to increase the mobility with other sectors. And yes, you need to take into account the context, but this is done in other sectors. There's best practice out there. This is not rocket science. It's really learning from HR departments elsewhere. It's not that difficult. It's just not there at the moment, because every time I talk to researchers about it, especially those who have been in academia their entire life, they don't know what I'm talking about. That's the challenge. They don't understand at the moment. There's a lot of effort needed to make them understand what we're talking about when we talk about competencies. One answer I often get is we can't hire people because they're kind, which completely misses the point. But that's, you know, that's the state of where we are at the moment. I've had a very long discussion also actually with Maria Leptin at the ERC about this. And I think we're getting to some type of understanding there, but it took quite a lot of effort to explain what I was going on about. I think I'll end there because we have other people waiting, but I don't know, Claire, whether you wanted to still... No.
Can we have a round of applause for this amazing panel? Thank you very much.